My name is Mary Chilton Winslow. My father was James Chilton. My husband is John Winslow. And I hope that you will enjoy my house. I hope that you will come in and sit by my fire or my fireplace. And I'm hoping that you came because you would like to hear the stories of over 50 years ago when I was the first person to step onto Plymouth Rock off the Mayflower. I'm happy to tell those stories. It makes me think about the past. My story actually starts in the Netherlands when my parents, my mother and my father and I, said goodbye to my two sisters. And we got onto a boat called the Speedwell and sailed to Southampton, England from the Netherlands. When we got to England, we were transferred to the Mayflower, where we discovered that there were a number of people who were also going who didn't belong to our congregation in Leiden, from Leiden or to our particular separatist church. But we were very happy, and I was especially happy because I discovered that there were a number of young girls who were about my age, I was only 13, who were going to go along with us. So you can imagine how happy I was to discover that, and we became great friends. We entertained ourselves on the boat by telling stories and by playing games. The names of those girls were Priscilla Mullins, who was the oldest. She was 17 at the time. Constance Hopkins, who was 14. Elizabeth Tilley, who was 13. And a girl named Desire Minter, who actually belonged to our congregation in Leiden. She was herself an orphan and had been made the ward of Governor Carver and his wife Catherine. Catherine had been a great friend of our family. She was the sister of our own dear Pastor Robinson's, Pastor Robinson, and had been a witness at my sister Isabella's wedding. So she had really truly been a great friend of our family. So it's really fabulous when you are able to have great friends on a very long ocean voyage, particularly one that is taken in the winter from over the Atlantic, which is rough at any time of year, but which is especially rough in the wintertime. It was so rough that we would often not be able to actually go up onto the deck in order to take our air. So we entertained ourselves below decks. John Howland, who was the Carver's servant, did, however, think that he would be able to go up on deck, and so he did, and was immediately swept overboard. But luckily for him, he was able to grab a hold of some of the lines to the mainsail and was dragged back on board, and therefore we didn't lose him. John had a great deal of interest in Desire Minter. I think he was really wanting to court Desire, but I'm not sure that Desire had the same feelings for him. Our friend Constance Hopkins told us that her father was the only person on board who'd actually been to America. He had regaled the entire family with stories of his youth when he'd been on a boat and it had shipwrecked on the island of Bermuda. Then he and his friends built a new craft and were able to come to the Jamestown colony in Virginia. He told everyone that the shipwreck on Bermuda was really the inspiration for Shakespeare's play The Tempest. I don't know that I actually believe that part of the story, but Constance assured us that he really had been to America and the shipwreck really had taken place. Constance's stepmother, Elizabeth, had a baby while we were under sail, and we all thought it was incredibly appropriate that she should name him Oceanus. What a fabulous name for a child who was born on the ocean. At the same time, John Alden, who was the ship's cooper, a cooper is a man who makes barrels, and of course we needed a lot of barrels, had taken a great interest in my friend Priscilla Mullins. And she, in her own way, was also taking a great interest in him. She spent a lot of her time asking John how barrels were made. When we finally landed, or saw land, which was, I believe, on November the 11th, we found that we were in a bay called Cape Cod Bay. So a number of the men left the ship on small boats and went ashore to find a place that would be suitable for us to live in and to form our new settlement. If you think that the women were not busy, you would be wrong, because we were set to doing the laundry. You can imagine that 66 days at sea, most of it below decks, would make our clothes be very dirty and very smelly, which they were. So we were set to making the clothes be clean. While many of the women went ashore as well in order to do that laundry, and so while they were there, we were put into charge, those of us who were older, were put in charge of the young girls, or the younger children, who, you can also imagine, were extremely rambunctious after 66 days being shut up in a boat and not getting enough exercise. One of them, a young boy who was particularly troublesome, was a young boy named Francis Billington. Somehow, he got a hold of his father's musket and fired it in the cabin of the Mayflower, and sparks fell down all around open barrels of gunpowder. We were so lucky that he didn't manage to blow up the boat. On a most serious note, I should tell you that while we were at anchor in Cape Cod Bay, my father became increasingly ill. He had been fighting scurvy for some time, and he thought that he just had a bad cold, but it appeared that that was not the case. My mother and I did everything we could think of to keep him comfortable and warm and eating, but he simply didn't recover, and on December the 8th, he died. Losing father was terribly difficult and hard for Mother and me. He had been such a source of strength for the entire family, and he was a rock and a leader in our congregation. He had been one of the principal people who were interested in relocating our congregation to the New World. So it was especially sad that he never made it ashore. About this time, or just shortly after Father's death, Governor Carver and Elder Brewster announced to the entire company that a suitable place had at last been found for us to have our settlement, and it was at a place that was already mapped. It had been mapped by Captain John Smith, and according to John Smith, it had been named by Charles Stuart, the Prince of Wales, and it was called Plymouth, after the Plymouth in England. So what we could have our new place of settlement, we were going to call it the Plymouth Plantation, and it also meant that when we sent messages back to our friends in England and in Leiden, we could say to them, this is a place that has already been mapped, it is on a map, you can actually see where it is that we are now living. Prior to our moving onto shore, Governor Carver and Elder Brewster decided that they would ask me if I would be the first person to step off the boat onto the rock. And it was a ceremonial duty, of course, because people had already been on shore, but I was given that honor, and I was given that honor because my father had been such a great supporter of this effort. And I, of course, was delighted to be able to do that, and so I did. On December 20th of 1620, we began unloading the boat and moving on shore. The very first task we had to accomplish was to build a shelter so that we could move all of our belongings onto shore and out of the Mayflower, because Captain Jones was very anxious to return his ship and bring more people or whatever. He was a shipman. So on Christmas Day of 1620, the men of our congregation began the building of a building. We could do this on Christmas Day because as separatists, we don't celebrate Christmas Day. There was a lot of grumbling from those who did not belong to the congregation, but a meeting of minds happened, and eventually everybody chipped in and we began building the buildings. That first winter was extremely difficult. Many people died. In January, my mother became ill and she died. So now I was truly an orphan. But I was not the only one. My friends Priscilla Mullins and Elizabeth Tilley also lost both their parents and all the members of their family. In fact, Constance Hopkins is the only one of us who didn't lose someone and was not made an orphan by the sickness. Many of us were very ill, including the sailors from the Mayflower. They were, so those of us who were not so sick, that would be the girls, we were young and reasonably strong, and so we became the nurses for the children, for everyone. We were all kept incredibly busy caring for the sick and cooking. It was really hard on everyone, and mainly because we were forced to drink water. None of us had ever drunk water before. We had all been used to drinking beer. But we had to save the beer in order for Captain Jones to have enough beer for his sailors to go back to England. In fact, William Bradford, who was ill, asked very politely, could he please have a small can of beer? And a sailor told him that if he was his own father, he wouldn't give him a can of beer under the circumstances. So as spring finally came, we discovered that we had lost, of the 104 souls that came here, we had lost all but 53 of us. So half of our numbers were cut. We buried those dead in shallow, unmarked graves, and we did so because we didn't want the savages to know how weak we had become and how our numbers were so vastly reduced. We didn't actually see any savages, but we were sure that we were being watched, and so we were very careful. This, however, came to an end in March when we were all out clearing fields to build new houses and to plant, when striding across the field came a man who was nearly naked and wearing only a belt with a span of leather, perhaps this big or a little bigger, around his waist. And he marched himself directly into the center of our settlement, spread wide his arms, and said, "Welcome, Englishmen!" Well, you could have knocked us all over with a feather. Here was this man who was enormous and naked, and he spoke to us in our own language. He told us that his name was Samoset, that he was an Algonquin Sagamore, or chieftain, and that he was from Maine, but he was here visiting the Wampanoag, who were the local tribe. He told us that he had learned some English because there were English fishermen who were in Maine, and he knew the names of most of the captains and masters and commanders who were here in this country. He immediately said, "Could I have some beer?" But of course, we didn't give him any beer. He was given a small cup of strong water, which is a little like brandy, a dry biscuit, some butter, some cheese, some pudding, and a piece of mallard. He set to eating, described himself as extremely happy at having this to eat, and said he had eaten much the same fare among his English friends. This went on. From this first meeting, we had several others with Samoset, and then we met Chief Massasoit, who was the chieftain of the Wampanoag tribe. Samoset told us that this place was called Pawtuxet, and that up until several years before, it had been a thriving village. But a strange plague had come through and killed every man, woman, and child who lived there. So the local people thought that as long as there was no one living there, we were perfectly free to use this place as our place of abode. And so we did. After several more meetings with Massasoit, Governor Carver and Massasoit made a treaty of friendship and alliance, and in goodwill, Massasoit sent somebody to come and live with us. This man was named Squanto. He was a man who had lived in Pawtuxet, and he was captured sometime earlier, and by the English and taken to Spain as a slave. He, however, was clever enough to escape Spain. He made his way to England, where he learned English, and was then brought back to this country by the English. When he arrived here, he came to Pawtuxet and was amazed to discover that everyone that he had ever known, all of his family, were dead. So he had taken up residence with Massasoits people. He said he was very happy, actually, to be with us because it made him feel like he was closer to his dead relatives. In the spring, he taught us how to plant things using fish as manure in rows. And without his help, we would have been in great trouble. That particular spring, we planted 20 acres of corn, 6 acres of barley and peas. And by the end of the season, our corn had done extremely well. Our barley was so-so, and our peas were not worth picking. But without the help of the Wampanoag, we would never have been able to continue the year. We discovered then, of course, that the Wampanoag were not savages at all, but kind and generous people, and they were very good friends to us. Captain Jones finally was able to depart in April of 1621. He had to wait so long because so many of his crew members were ill and were unable to travel. He did, however, make an offer to all of us that if anyone wanted to go back to England, he was happy to take them at no charge. However, no one took him up on that. One of his crew members, however, John Alden, chose to stay in this country. He said that he thought he would do better than he could possibly do in England, that he could build a better life for himself here. But really, I think it was because he was very interested in Priscilla. After we took in all of the harvest, Governor Bradford came to us and said he had had an idea that we should have a Thanksgiving celebration, much the same as we had had when we lived in Leiden. That it would be a Thanksgiving in honor of the people who had died, who came with us, and to celebrate the fruits of our labor. So it was decided that we would have this feast, we would have a day of celebration, and in the old way, the way we had done it in Leiden, we played games, and Captain Miles Standish exercised his militia, which meant that there were a lot of people shooting off their muskets. When Massasoit and his people heard the shooting of guns, he brought 90 people over to see what was going on. And when he discovered that we were having a celebration, he sent men out to hunt, and they came back with 4 deer. Earlier, Governor Bradford had sent out 4 of our men to hunt for birds or fowl, and they had brought back so many wild birds that it was enough to feed our people for a week. With the additional deer, we were able to have a feast that went on for 3 days. I should remind you that at the time of this huge feast, there were 53 of us left from the original passengers on the Mayflower. And of that 53, only 9 of us were women. There were 4 married women and the 5 of us girls. Let me tell you, we were extremely busy keeping everybody fed for 3 days of feasting. That 150 people was mostly men, although of course there were some children. In December of 1621, just a little over a year after we arrived, we were treated with another ship coming, the Fortune. There were 35 people on this ship. Some of them were from our Leiden congregation, and some of them were friends and relatives of people from England who had come with us. With the arrival of the Fortune, our population nearly doubled. In 1623, 2 years later, it was decided that every adult in the colony would be given a piece of land, a plot of land of their very own. Because I was, by that time, 16, I was allotted my own plot. It was between Miles Standish and John Alden. By this time, John Alden and Priscilla were married. She had waited a very long time for John to work up enough nerve to actually ask her to marry him. There is an old story that Miles Standish had tried to court her, but if he did, I don't think she was at all interested. Really, from the very beginning, Priscilla only had eyes for John Alden, and John, after all, really stayed in this country because of Priscilla. Unfortunately, not everyone was happy living here in Plymouth, and so Gilbert Winslow and Desire Minter decided to go back to England. This made John Howland very sad because he, of course, wanted desperately to be able to take care of Desire. He did, however, after Desire was gone, get over his sadness because then he married Elizabeth Tilley. During that winter, I moved in with Susanna and Edward Winslow in order to help take care of the children, and of course because I didn't have any other family there. While I was living there, I really learned to love John Winslow. He is a very fine man, and so 3 years later, we were married. We were married in a civil ceremony, which is how we did things. We didn't have church weddings, we did civil ceremonies, and that ceremony was performed by Governor Bradford. In 1630, yet another ship, the Lion, came, and to my great delight, aboard were my sister Isabella, her husband Roger Chandler, and their 3 children. So for the first time in 10 years, I was reunited with some members of my family. It is a little sad for us because our sister Ingle and her husband chose to stay in Leiden. They told us that they really felt that they belonged in the Netherlands and not in the New World, and so they stayed there. And of course it meant that we would never see our sister Ingle again. Miles Standish, Jonathan Brewster, and John Alden decided to leave Plymouth and found a new town, which they called Duxbury. It was across the Plymouth Harbor to the northern side, and the land over there was much more appropriate for raising cattle, which is what they wanted to do. Eventually, my sister Isabella and her husband Roger also moved to Duxbury, but John and I chose to stay in Plymouth because John had become a fur trader and was going up the coast and up the Kennebec River into Maine in order to do that business. But as his trading business got bigger, it required that he build a couple of ships for himself. And that meant that we were going to have to move because Plymouth Harbor is really not deep enough to allow for shipping. So we sold our house and our property to our daughter Mary and her husband, who wished to stay in Plymouth, and we took the younger children and moved to Boston, which has a much deeper harbor and was therefore better for John's trading. It has been a very interesting and long life. It's been a long time since the 50 years ago when I was the first person to put my foot onto Plymouth Rock. We have just bought this house that we live in, which is described by the man who sold it to us, or in the papers, as a mansion house. It is certainly a far cry from the places that we lived when we were on board the ships, the Mayflower, coming here. I think often of my father and how his vision and his bravery and his steadfastness made all of this possible for us.